so now we need to talk about the relationship of the hypothalamus and the pituitary to each other and then to the rest of the glands in the body. So the hypothalamus is the master regulator of the autonomic nervous system, as you learned last semester, but it is also the master controller of the endocrine system, and that's because of the control it exerts over the master gland, the pituitary, which is also known as the hypophysis. So that's another name for pituitary, is hypophysis. And the relationship of the hypothalamus to the pituitary is different depending on whether or not you're looking at the posterior pituitary or the anterior pituitary. So we're going to start out looking at the relationship of the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary. And I'm actually going to draw this picture over and over and over again. So this is anterior. This is posterior. And what we're talking about right now is the posterior pituitary. So we'll talk more about the anterior pituitary in a little bit, but the hypothalamus sits up here and is the regulator of both. And it has a different anatomical relationship to the anterior pituitary as it does to the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary is actually an extension of hypothalamic neurons whose soma reside up here in the hypothalamus and whose axons extend down here through this region called the infundibulum to synapse on this part we call the posterior pituitary. So if we look at that, anatomically, we would see that we have all these somas of hypothalamic neurons that reach their axons through the infundibulum and synapse into the posterior pituitary. So in the posterior pituitary, this is neural tissue. And so because of that, another name for the posterior pituitary is the neurohypophysis, the neural pituitary. So this is also the neurohypophysis. Another name for this region, if you're like taking an endocrinology class, is the pars nervosa. So the posterior pituitary is connected to the hypothalamus by this tract of neuron axons. So if you remember last semester, we said that groups of axons running together in the central nervous system run together in tracts. So this is what we call the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. So right here where these neurons are running together, this is the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. And so when you're working on lab, you'll look at this histologically, and you'll see some scattered nuclei around those neurons. And you might be thinking, what are those nuclei? What cells are those? I thought all of these somas were up in the hypothalamus, and that's where you would find the nucleus of a neuron. So what are those nuclei? Well, what other cells can be found in the central nervous system? Glial cells. So if you're looking at a slide, how you're going to be able to tell the anterior from posterior lobe is that the anterior pituitary is really, really cellular. We'll get there in a minute. It's glandular, but we've got a lot of cells packed in here. The posterior pituitary is not very cellular, and that's because all of our cell bodies are up here in the hypothalamus, and then we just have these tracts of axon, this tract of axons running down with our axon terminals then terminating on the posterior lobe. So then we would also have blood vessels right here that can take those posterior pituitary hormones immediately out to the blood so they can have their impact on their targets. So we'll talk about that. So again, this is the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract, and it is connecting the somas of our hypothalamic neurons to the axon terminals that we find in the posterior pituitary. There are two hormones that are released from the posterior pituitary. So we're going to talk more about those, the stimulus for their release, and what happens when they enter the body. So since these hormones are being released from neurons into the blood, the next two hormones are called neurohormones. Neurohormones, also called nonapeptides. That's about their chemical structure. But they are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. So we're going to start learning learning hormone nomenclature. And oxytocin, oxy is the abbreviation for oxytocin. Oxytocin is released and causes contraction of reproductive smooth muscle. So its target is reproductive smooth muscle, and the effect is to stimulate contraction. So oxytocin is produced in hypothalamic neurons and then shot down and stored in vesicles there at the posterior pituitary and will be released into the blood. So oxytocin enters the blood and it goes to its target, which is reproductive smooth muscle. And the effect of reproductive smooth muscle is that we will stimulate contraction. Welcome to Positive Feedback with Good by Janessa Jacobs. When a woman is at the end of pregnancy, also known as gestation, she is going to go into a positive feedback loop. The baby will drop and push on her cervix. This will cause neural signals that will run up to mom's hypothalamus and stimulate oxytocin release from her posterior pituitary. The oxytocin will enter her blood and do what it does, hurt like hell. Stimulate reproductive smooth muscle contraction. This will cause baby to push on mom's cervix, which will cause more neural stimulation of oxytocin release, which will cause more uterine contraction, which will hurt like hell. Continue over and over again in a positive feedback loop until the baby is born. Sounds awful, not positive. Yeah, but then you get a baby and that is pretty great. So the positive feedback loop that's engaged during labor and delivery is kind of one of the more easy ways to understand oxytocin's stimulus for release. So for that, if we were looking at the top of the system up here, what is going to stimulate these neurons to release oxytocin you just learned about, it would be pressure on the cervix. So pressure on the cervix is going to cause oxytocin release, which is going to target, in this case, the myometrium of the uterus. The uterus is going to contract, we get more pressure, have this positive feedback loop. Another thing that's going to stimulate the release of oxytocin, just on a normal day-to-day basis, would actually be orgasm. So orgasm is also nervous stimulation, but at the time of orgasm, in monogamous breeders anyway, both males and females will release oxytocin, which stimulates reproductive smooth muscle contraction. So it's normally released during orgasm. And then another stimulus for oxytocin release is actually suckling. So suckling is nervous stimulation of oxytocin release, and again, oxytocin will enter the blood and target reproductive smooth muscle, this time in the mammary region, and stimulate milk letdown. So for here, if we're looking at specific areas in reproductive smooth muscle, we could say at the mammary glands will stimulate milk letdown. Now, in a little bit, we're going to talk about these anterior pituitary hormones, and there's one called prolactin. It's prolactation. It stimulates milk protein synthesis, so the two of those hormones are needed together in order to nurse a baby. We'll talk more about that. I'm bringing it up now because what's going to happen when this positive feedback loop is happening and a woman is at the end of gestation and she's got this really big surge in oxytocin, oxytocin is also going to be, it's going to be high in all of the blood, so it's going to be high enough to come over here and inhibit the inhibitor of prolactin release. So it will be released and it will inhibit this inhibitor. So we'll talk more about that in a little bit, but I just wanted to bring it up now while we're talking about the posterior pituitary and oxytocin. So the regular stimulus for oxytocin release is orgasm, and then we will have a really big positive feedback loop of oxytocin release going when a woman is delivering the baby, and then as long as she's nursing the baby and that baby suckles, then oxytocin will continue to be released. So those are the three neural stimuli mechanisms that we have to get oxytocin released. Again, oxytocin enters the blood, targets reproductive smooth muscle, and stimulates contractions. of that muscle. So depending on which organ you're talking about will determine what kind of contractions are happening. We'll talk more about that when we get to the reproductive system. So that was oxytocin. Our next posterior pituitary hormone is one called antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. So it's ADH, the antidiuretic hormone. Diuresis is peeing. How do you stop peeing or be anti-peeing? You take that water back. So antidiuretic hormone's target is the kidney. And the effect of the kidney is that it's going to stimulate water reabsorption. So, if we look up here in the hypothalamus, we would see that we have these neurons that produce antidiuretic hormone. It's stored in synaptic vesicles down here in the posterior pituitary. And antidiuretic hormone can be triggered to be released in a couple of different ways. When would we not want to pee? When would we want to take water back from our urine? Well, if we were low on water, so if we were dehydrated. So what type of stimulus would that be? Hormonal, humoral, or neural? It would be humoral. The absence of water in your blood, or dehydration, is going to stimulate the hypothalamus to release antidiuretic hormone. So what we could say here is that a decrease in water, also known as dehydration, is going to stimulate ADH release. ADH will enter the blood and go to its target at the kidneys and stimulate the kidneys to reabsorb any water that was potentially going to be lost in urine. So that is the neural way that we can, so that is the humoral way that we can get ADH release. ADH can also be hormonally released due to this hormone called angiotensin II. So that is a big long pathway called the renin-angiotensin system, and we're going to go over that next class. So for now, we'll put it in our back pockets and we'll put it on our notes that we can also have a hormone called angiotensin II, abbreviated ANG2, Roman numeral 2. Angiotensin II will hormonally stimulate ADH release. Again, ADH will enter the blood, target the kidneys, and stimulate water reabsorption. So it's going to be important when we get this going. We've had a drop in blood pressure, and one of the ways that we can increase blood pressure is to increase blood volume. And we can do that if we drop urine production and bring this water back to our blood. The relationship of the anterior pituitary to the hypothalamus is slightly different. The posterior pituitary, as you recall, was the hypothalamic neurons extending down and synapsing in this region we call the posterior lobe of the pituitary. The anterior lobe is the glandular part of the pituitary, the master gland part, that's under the control of the hypothalamus, which is releasing and inhibiting hormones. But this is glandular tissue that is then going to release tropic hormones and hormones that go out into the blood and stimulate our other glands. So the anterior lobe, since it's cellular and since it's glandular, has a couple of different names. Adeno is the prefix for glandular, so we also call it the adenohypophysis. But it can also be called the pars distalis. And anatomically, it is not actually connected to the hypothalamus. The control that the hypothalamus exerts over the anterior pituitary is through neurohormones that are released into a blood vessel network. So this will be the first time probably that you've heard of a portal system, but a portal system is a kind of special capillary bed arrangement where blood comes into the first capillary bed through arteries, and then it goes into a capillary bed. Then it goes through portal veins into a second capillary bed, and then that capillary bed drains into the venous system. Usually, in the cardiovascular system, blood leaves the heart, enters an artery, goes to capillaries, and then goes back to veins. In a portal system, we go through two capillary beds first. So that's how the hypothalamus is related to the pituitary, and the anterior lobe is through this kind of specialized blood vessel network. So we'll draw this picture again. And now we're going to really be focusing in here on the anterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus is up here. And now down here we have our anterior lobe of our pituitary, our adrenal hypophysis, or pars distalis. And this blood vessel network is called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. So we have our first capillary bed up here in the hypothalamus, and then we've got these portal veins that are going to extend through the infundibulum and lead into our second capillary bed that we find down here in the anterior pituitary that is surrounding all of these tropic cells that are going to release our tropic hormones into the blood. And then this second capillary blood will empty into our venous circulation that's on its way back to the heart. So this setup here, again, is called the portal system, and this one specifically is called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. So again, portal systems are blood vessel networks where we have our blood going through two capillary beds before returning to the general circulation. And we actually name each of these capillary beds. So this first capillary bed here is called the primary plexus. And into the primary plexus, our hypothalamus is going to release inhibiting hormones. So those will be neurohormones because they're released from neurons into the blood. Those neurohormones will then go through these portal veins and enter our secondary plexus. So here we have portal veins, and down here our second capillary bed is called our secondary plexus. And when we enter this capillary bed, this blood is going to pool around cells here in the anterior pituitary. So any release and release inhibiting hormones that are present in this blood will pool around cells down here and bind to their targets. What makes a target a target? It's receptors. So there are a bunch of different cells down here, and the only ones that are going to respond to specific hormones in this blood are the ones with receptors for that neurohormone. So we'll look at a list of those in just a minute. So this is the anatomical relationship, again, of the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, and this is occurring through this blood vessel network. So if we were to zoom in here more, then we would see up here we have these somas of hypothalamic neurons up here in the hypothalamus, and they're extending these axons down, and the axon terminals are synapsing onto blood vessels in that primary plexus. The area where an axon synapses onto a blood vessel is called a neurohemal organ. So that's what's happening here. And the hypothalamus is going to release inhibiting hormones into that blood, and they'll then pool around cells in our anterior pituitary. Okay. So, I am going to draw this next picture, well, basically that picture over and over and over again, but we're just going to look at specific cells this time. So this is all one pituitary, but we're going to look at one pathway kind of at a time for the moment. So just remember, this is all occurring in the same hypothalamus and pituitary. We're just kind of looking at some specific cells we're going to zoom in on. So now we're going to be looking again at our anterior lobe. So our posterior is back here, just hanging out. And in our anterior lobe, let's look at the cells that release this hormone, growth hormone. So the cells in the anterior pituitary that release growth hormone are cells called somatotropes. Somatotropes. So we have all of these cells down here, but some of them are called somatotropes. And somatotropes have receptors on their surface for actually not one, but two hormones, two neurohormones that comes from the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is sitting up here, and the hormones that it releases that have an effect on our somatotropes are two hormones. The first is called growth hormone releasing hormone. Which I am from now on going to abbreviate as GHRH. And the growth hormone inhibiting hormone, which I'm just now going to abbreviate as GIH. GIH. This is a chemical called somatostatin. So I'm going to put that in parentheses, the growth hormone inhibiting hormone. And these both have receptors on the surface of our somatotropes. So if we look at our somatotropes down here, then we have a growth hormone inhibiting hormone receptor and a growth hormone releasing hormone receptor. Now, these cells interact in an antagonistic fashion. A moment ago we talked about hormone interactions. And if both, this is actually one example where you might see both hormones present in this blood at the same time. If the hypothalamus was releasing both growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone, and both of them bound to these receptors, they have antagonistic effects. If only growth hormone releasing hormone were present, then somatotropes would respond and they would release growth hormone to the blood. So with growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus bound, they would release growth hormone. Okay, well, if we also then put in our growth hormone release inhibiting hormone and it binds its receptors, it's actually stronger. The inhibitor is stronger than the releasing hormone in this case, so it would win. And if growth hormone inhibiting hormone is present, you will not have growth hormone release, even in the presence of growth hormone releasing hormone. So, at some point, in order to grow, we're going to have to inhibit that inhibitor. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So our somatotropes then release growth hormone, and growth hormone is going to target like all cells in growing bodies, and then it has a couple targets after growth, like the liver is always a target for growth hormone. It produces these things called insulin-like growth factors that then... Okay, so then if the inhibitor wins, and if both are present, we don't get growth hormone, how do we get growth hormone release so that we can have growth? Well, that's by inhibiting the inhibitor. So in the back of your diencephalon, you have the epithalamus that contains your pineal body, which releases melatonin as the sun goes down. So as the sun is going down, melatonin secretion is going up, and so as melatonin is going up, we start getting this increase in melatonin, and what it will do is inhibit our inhibitor. So melatonin inhibits the growth hormone inhibiting hormone at night, and then growth hormone releasing hormone can do its thing. Growth hormone will be released, and then your kid will wake up in the morning and you'll say, oh, it's like you grew 2 inches overnight. So did your child actually grow 2 inches overnight? No, but growth does actually occur uninhibited by growth hormone inhibiting hormone at night, and this is why. So yeah, what does growth hormone do? Let's talk about that. So how is growth hormone regulated? Let's recap. Growth hormone releasing hormone stimulates somatotropes to release growth hormone. Growth hormone inhibiting hormone inhibits somatotropes from releasing growth hormone. The inhibitor is stronger than the releaser, so if both are present, we don't release growth hormone. In order to get growth hormone release, then we have to inhibit growth hormone inhibiting hormone, and we do that at night when melatonin is high and inhibits the hypothalamus from releasing that inhibitor. Growth hormone is then released and is now going to go out and do to the body everything that we're going to talk about. So, growth hormone all on its own overall is lipolytic, which means it stimulates fat breakdown, and it's anabolic, which means that it stimulates protein buildup. So the effects of growth hormone is actually everything that most dieters are trying to accomplish in their body. So kids are really lucky. They have it really, really great. So what does growth hormone do? Directly, its effects are on glucose metabolism. So growth hormone has anti-insulin effects. What does that mean? It's going to raise blood sugar. Why do we want to raise blood sugar? Well, we're growing, and that's going to be energetically costly, so we're going to need growth hormone for that. The growth effects are going to happen through an indirect mechanism we'll talk about in a second. So directly, growth hormone is going to be able to stimulate adipose to do what we call lipolysis. Lysis means breakdown. What are we breaking down? Lipids. So we're going to be able to break down that stored energy and use it for gluconeogenesis in the liver, which is making new glucose from non-carbohydrate substrates. And so then we can use that to fuel growth, which is awesome. So for targets of growth hormone, we could say at adipose, it will stimulate lipolysis. So what's going to happen is we're going to release these non-esterified fatty acids to the blood. Those are going to go to the liver, which is our, well, let's just call this another target. Liver. And our liver is going to use that to do gluconeogenesis. If we look at this word and break it down, genesis is to make. What? Glucose. What kind? New stuff. So glucose, new, genesis. So we're making new glucose from non-carbohydrate substrates. In this case, we're using fat to make glucose and store it, which is pretty awesome. The other thing that our growth hormone is going to be able to do is stimulate our extraskeletal growth and help to stimulate protein anabolism. How does it do that? It's actually also going to go to the liver directly and stimulate the liver to not only do gluconeogenesis, but stimulate the liver to produce these other hormones called insulin-like growth factors. So growth hormone, when it binds to receptors on the liver, is going to stimulate the liver to produce IGFs, or insulin-like growth factors. Insulin-like growth factors are the hormones that are actually going to cause the growing effects of growth hormone. So insulin-like growth factors are going to be able to go to like your bone and your muscle and stimulate protein anabolism, which is the buildup of protein. So if you've ever heard of anabolic steroids, bodybuilders want to take anabolic steroids, they're trying to stimulate protein anabolism. Growth hormone does that through our insulin-like growth factors. So we could say at bone, for targets at bone and muscle, we are going to stimulate protein anabolism. At cartilage, we're actually going to stimulate cartilage growth. So after bone is done growing in adolescence and you fuse at the epiphyseal plate, your liver can still be a target for growth hormone. Growth hormone levels do decline, but they don't ever really go to zero. So those low levels of growth hormone will always be able to bind to the liver and always stimulate insulin-like growth factor production. And because of that, you'll always be able to have growth hormone, or you'll always be able to have cartilage growth. So that's why, if you've ever noticed your grandma and grandpa, they have bigger ears and bigger noses than when they were young and beautiful in all those photos. It's because your liver never stops being a target for that. So insulin-like growth factors are also going to be able to go to cartilage and stimulate growth. So the most important effects of growth hormone, its direct effects, are on glucose, blood glucose availability. Now we can use all of this glucose to fuel growth. So that growth is happening through insulin-like growth factors, which target like bone and skeletal muscle to increase protein anabolism, target your cartilage to increase growth there as well. So that is how that's going to work. So growth hormone released from the somatotropes of the anterior pituitary will enter the system and have these effects. All right. Next, this is what we call the Hpg axis. The Hpg axis, which is the hypothalamus, pituitary, thyroid axis. So our hypothalamus-pituitary-thyroid axis. So this is going to be responsible for getting us thyroid hormones. Thyroid hormones are important in the body for increasing metabolic rate. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. If we look at the relationship of the hypothalamus to the pituitary and this axis, our hypothalamus is sitting up here producing this releasing hormone called Thyrotropin-Releasing Hormone, or TRH. Thyrotropin-Releasing Hormone, or TRH. TRH is produced in somas of hypothalamic neurons and stored in axon terminals that are synapsing on that primary plexus of the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. So, TRH will be emptied into that portal system, enter the portal veins, and enter the secondary plexus, and then it's going to pool around cells there in the anterior pituitary called thyrotropes. So down here, the cells that have receptors for TRH are cells called thyrotropes. So when TRH, the thyrotropin-releasing hormone, is bound to receptors on thyrotropes, they will release thyrotropin, also known as the thyroid stimulating hormone. So one of the things that can be kind of irritating about the endocrine system is that not only do you have to memorize all these new organs and all these new things, but you also have to memorize what's called hormone nomenclature, or all of the abbreviations and names for all of these hormones. So TRH is the thyrotropin-releasing hormone. If we know that, then we can break apart what it does. It releases thyrotropin. Well, what is thyrotropin? It's TSH, the thyroid stimulating hormone. So what does TSH do? It stimulates the thyroid to release thyroid hormones. We're going to talk more about thyroid hormones and what they do next class, but let's just put this in our pocket for now. So, thyrotropin-releasing hormone is produced in the hypothalamus and binds to thyrotropes in the anterior pituitary, and they will respond by releasing thyrotropin, which is also known as the thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. So TSH is going to enter the blood, and it's going to bind to its target cells in the thyroid gland that are called follicular cells. So we'll pick up with that when we talk about the thyroid next class, but for now, let's just put this in our back pocket. Okay, this next axis is called the Hypothalamo-Pituitary-Adrenal Axis, or the HPA axis. The HPA axis, which stands for Hypothalamo-Pituitary Adrenal Axis. And this is the one that controls the release of your stress hormone cortisol. So it's pretty darn important. So if we look at the hormones that are involved, the hypothalamus is producing a hormone called corticotropin-releasing hormone. It produces those up in those somas of hypothalamic neurons hanging out there, and then it's stored in the axon terminals, again, of those axons that are synapsing on that primary plexus of the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. So when you're stressed out, or at certain times of the day, you will release corticotropin-releasing hormone, and it will enter that system and bind to its targets. So any cell that has a target for CRH is a target, and those cells are called corticotropes. So our corticotropes are the only cells in the anterior pituitary with corticotropin-releasing hormone receptors, and they have corticotropin-releasing hormone receptors because when their hormone is bound, they're going to release what? Corticotropin, also known as ACTH. So ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone, is corticotropin. And so again, if we break down the whole name that we have to memorize for this abbreviation, it tells us what it's doing. And if we know its other name, it tells us what this is doing. So the hypothalamus is going to release corticotropin-releasing hormone, which will bind to CRH receptors on corticotropes. And when CRH receptors are bound, corticotropes will release corticotropin, which is also known as the adrenocorticotropic hormone. It goes to the adrenal gland. Tropic is like to make. And what are we going to make? We're going to make a glucocorticoid. So again, we'll talk more about that tomorrow. but for now, just be aware of that. This is our Hpg axis. The H part, hypothalamus, is releasing corticotropin-releasing hormone. The P part, the pituitary, is releasing corticotropin, or the adrenocorticotropic hormone. And the A part is going to be releasing cortisol, our stress hormone. We'll talk about that more tomorrow. Okay, so next we need to talk about the Hpg axis, or the Hypothalamo-Pituitary-Gonadal axis, which involves the hypothalamus, these cells in the anterior pituitary called gonadotropes, and the gonads. The gonads are the ovaries in the female and the testes in the male. So what's interesting here is that the anterior pituitary is going to be able to respond to the releasing hormone this time and release two gonadotropic hormones. So up here in the hypothalamus, the neurons that are releasing the releasing hormone are releasing a releasing hormone called the gonadotropic releasing hormone, or GnRH. And so what that stands for is the gonadotropic releasing hormone. And when the gonadotropic releasing hormone is released from neurons into that primary plexus, it will enter portal veins and then enter the secondary plexus and pull around all of the cells in the anterior pituitary. The only ones that have GnRH receptors are the gonadotropes, and when GnRH is bound, they will respond by releasing our gonadotropic hormones, or gonadotropins. So we have two this time, and we're going to go into a lot more detail about them when we get to the reproductive system. So for now, we'll say these are the gonadotropins, and they are FSH, the follicle stimulating hormone. This is going to stimulate some cells in the male called sustentacular cells, and then the luteinizing hormone, which is going to stimulate cells called interstitial endocrine cells, or Sertoli cells and Leydig cells in the male. The FSH in the female is going to trigger, is going to target some cells called follicular cells and then granulosa cells, and LH is going to target some cells called fecal cells. And FSH is really going to help with gamete development, and LH is really going to help with sex hormone production. But we'll talk more about that again a little bit next time, but a lot next week when we talk about the reproductive systems. So our last anterior pituitary hormone is prolactin, and it's not really a tropic hormone in the sense that it's going to a gland and stimulating the release of another hormone, but it is going to a gland and stimulating the release of milk. So prolactin is prolactation, and it is released from the anterior pituitary when a woman is lactating, and it is going to target the mammary glands and stimulate milk protein production. So we'll say that that is the target and the effect. Prolactin is going to target the mammary glands, and it's going to stimulate milk protein production. Now, the production of milk is different than the letdown of milk. You may recall when we talked about the posterior pituitary, we talked about oxytocin and its effect on stimulating reproductive smooth muscle. In the mammary glands, we said it stimulates milk letdown. So oxytocin is going to stimulate milk letdown. Prolactin is going to stimulate milk protein production. So when the two are working together, a woman is going to be able to lactate and nourish her growing offspring. So how does this work? What's the loop look like? So actually, on a normal day-to-day basis, we're all inhibiting prolactin release. And that's because unless you've just had a baby, you shouldn't be lactating. So the cells that release prolactin are these anterior pituitary cells called lactotropes. And lactotropes just right now, unless you're lactating, are just always being bound or binding their inhibiting hormone, the prolactin inhibiting hormone. So this is what's happening in all of us who are not lactating. Prolactin inhibiting hormone is bound to our lactotropes, and we are not releasing prolactin. Okay? So this prolactin inhibiting hormone is coming from neurons in the hypothalamus. Prolactin inhibiting hormone is dopamine. So that's its chemical. So just to depending on where you release and what you do determines what you're doing. But right here, it's prolactin inhibiting hormone. So dopamine released from these hypothalamic neurons into the primary plexus is the prolactin inhibiting hormone. So when dopamine is present in the primary plexus, it will enter portal veins, pool around all of our cells in the anterior pituitary and that secondary plexus. The only cells in the anterior pituitary that have prolactin inhibiting hormone receptors are lactotropes, and when it's bound, which is most of the time, we're not releasing prolactin. Okay, so how do we get prolactin release? Well, I mean, we must do this. Well, we've already talked about it. Back here is the posterior pituitary. If you recall, the posterior pituitary is an extension of hypothalamic neurons that are just synapsing down here in that posterior pituitary region. So when a woman is at the end of gestation and she starts that positive feedback loop, so the baby drops and is pushing on the cervix, causing her to release more oxytocin. That oxytocin enters the blood, stimulates uterine contraction, causes the baby to push on the cervix, yada, yada, yada. All of that happens over and over again until the baby's born. Well, those increasing oxytocin levels are increasing in the blood everywhere. So oxytocin is also high in the brain. And it's going to be able to bind oxytocin, or it's going to be able to bind oxytocin receptors on our prolactin inhibiting hormone releasing neurons. So when oxytocin is bound to these neurons, it inhibits them, and they will not release dopamine into the primary plexus. So in the absence of prolactin inhibiting hormone, you can release prolactin. So in the absence of prolactin inhibiting hormone, you can release prolactin. So now our lactotropes will start releasing prolactin. Prolactin will enter the blood and stimulate milk protein production. So this positive feedback loop at the end of gestation is going to be what sets a woman up for the ability to lactate and feed her offspring. And then what's going to keep the positive feedback loop going throughout all of lactation is the fact that oxytocin release can also be neurally stimulated by suckling. So as long as she is nursing the baby, so if the baby suckles, I would write it down here if I had my board, but if the baby suckles, that's going to stimulate oxytocin release. So oxytocin will now go and stimulate milk letdown. So the milk lets down, the baby is going to suckle some more, because it'll swallow and suckle some more, stimulate more oxytocin release.